Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be talking about Richard Land. We're going to be talking about the Christian Post, and we're going to be talking about their continued shilling for Ukraine and hailing Zelensky as the next Churchill. We're going to be talking about that dumpster fire of an article written by Richard Land. And before we get to that, Evangelical Dark Web is a Christian news gathering commentary ministry. You can support it over at evangelicaldarkweb.org/join on our Patreon-like system. Otherwise, hit the like button and subscribe if you are new. That helps out the channel a lot. So, Richard Land. Let's talk about Richard Land for a second. When you talk about the Southern Baptist Convention having a liberal drift, it really starts with Richard Land, in my opinion, because Richard Land, in my opinion, was always bad. He was always bad. He was the longtime head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and he was succeeded by Russell Moore. There's a big hint for you. Who was then succeeded by Brent Leatherwood, the current head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. So all three of these men were bad. All three of them. And Richard Land once counseled a married couple to get an abortion on the word of a ER doctor, which is highly dubious to anyone who understands pregnancy. But moreover, and perhaps more relatedly, the World Economic Forum and the ERLC go way back. This is an article I wrote 6 months ago, or over 6 months ago, last June, and it talks about Richard Land going to the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, is next week. So we might have some content on the World Economic Forum next week. But this just does shine a light on why Richard Land is so invested in Ukraine, because this is the World Economic Forum's proxy war. They are having a proxy war. It's really World War III. What's going on is World War III, because Russia's fighting all of NATO. For Ukraine, allegedly. It's for Ukraine. But it's really for the World Economic Forum, because Ukraine is not a free country. They're not fighting to be a free country. And, they're also the baddies here. And really the main baddies. So we're going to look at this article about Ukraine. It's written by Richard Land, an important litmus test for Western civilization. And the article starts off with basically Richard Land having a neocon, foreign policy view. He hasn't updated his foreign policy in like 30 years, and it shows. So he says the stakes could not be higher for the future of Western civilization than what is currently transpiring in Ukraine. So let's just pause for a second. What about what's going on in Brazil? How, the turmoil in Brazil? What about the 2020 election? What about how we just gave and bent over for tyranny the last 3 years? What about that? Those stakes are actually higher than Ukraine. Ukraine actually means nothing for the rest of Western civilization. That is a lie straight from the pit of hell, really. And next paragraph goes on to say, Vladimir Putin, the Russian oligarch and former KGB colonel, who has said the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the evil empire, which is not the same quote. He's mixing quotes here, which isn't exactly concise writing, of the old Soviet Union, has brutally invaded the sovereign country of Ukraine. Now, again, he's mixing evil empire in, but yeah, the context for Putin's quotes is more of a lament, but Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. They are fighting to join the European Union, which means that you're not a sovereign nation. If you're in the European Union, you're not a sovereign country. The European Union can literally dictate terms to you on how you tax, other regulations, and how your internet regulations work. You're not a sovereign country if you're in the European Union. That's why the UK left. They got their independence in 2016. So with that said, let's be clear. and he's doing the whole Obama line. Let me be clear. That's an Obama thing. Putin cannot fulfill his life goal of reconstructing the Russian Empire, for which much of the 20th century masqueraded as the USSR, without incorporating Ukraine as an integral part of the Russian state. First of all, the Soviets crushed the Russian Empire. They didn't rebuild the Russian Empire. They crushed it. So, not good on history here. And also, if Putin is the leader of Russia, that's in the Russian interest. He has failed to communicate why Ukraine is, first of all, part of Western civilization. You know, they would probably fall on the dividing line of the East. Because, historically speaking, West versus East has typically, actually, okay, let's do post-fall of Rome. West versus East has typically been a division between the Latin Church and the Eastern Church. That is typically what divides Eastern and Western Europe, the Latin Church and the Eastern Church. That is why Hungary is technically part of the West. And Ukraine is East. And Poland is West. Because the Latin Church and the Eastern Church had a split. So that is really what dictates what is Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, which has largely been synonymous with Western civilization. So Ukraine is not actually part of Western civilization. And they never have been. Ukraine is very different from Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, very tyrannical countries, especially Lithuania if you've seen them the last 3 years. And other former Eastern Bloc post-World War II satellite states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. Hungary does not support Ukraine in this war, by the way. Ukrainians are the least Slavic ethnic cousins of Russians. In fact, Putin and the Russians are wrong when they said that Ukraine is not really a nation, and it has been and is really part of Russia. The fake nation, if there was one, was the Soviet Union, which was an attempt to recreate the Russian Empire under the guise of an emergent communist ideology. When the bankrupt ideology finally collapsed in 1991, 15 separate historical nations re-emerged, including Russia and Ukraine. Now, again, not the same empire. It's kind of different. And then we got to look to the part where, when has Ukraine ever really been an independent nation? To me, the most they've been independent is the fact that I believe that the Eastern Church had like a separate, I don't want to call it denomination, but, you know, an evangelical understanding is, you know, there's different Eastern Orthodox denominations. And Ukraine, I believe, has had an Eastern Orthodox Church branch or denomination for hundreds of years. So that's pretty much the oldest of Ukraine having a distinct national identity from Russia. Otherwise, Kiev was the first Russian capital, and I believe it changed because Kiev got sacked and Moscow became a more convenient base of operations. And obviously, a lot of Khanates came and went along the Russian and Ukrainian history. There's a lot of steppe civilizations invading and just ruling for centuries. That's history. So, moving on, and then, you know, he wants to dig at the Soviet Union. I don't blame him. The problem is, the Soviet Union is dead, and the evil empire we were fighting in the Cold War is now us. That's the issue here. That's the scary part here. It's not Russia. China to some degree, but you know who colluded with the Chinese to create a bioweapon in the lab that shocked the whole world? That was America. That was Francis Collins. That was Anthony Fauci. So, yeah. Who's the evil empire? Let's see. After being brutally subjugated by the USSR for 69 years, including the infamous created famine of 1932-1933, in which millions of Ukrainian peasants were deliberately starved to death. On December 1st, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and 90% of Ukrainian voters cast their votes for independence from Russia. Okay, that's the collapse of the Soviet Union. Worth noting that the fall of Ukraine during the Soviet War, the Russian Civil War, the Russian-Soviet Revolution, was Russians had organized the defense of Ukraine, and it was called like South Russia. It was a quasi-military state led by Pyotr Wrangel. So, little history lesson for you, but he was pretty based. He was an anti-communist, based anti-Bolshevik, and he operated in what is currently Ukraine/Russia, and then I believe it looped around through Georgia. So, that was like the last vestige of Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union, I believe. There could have been some like intermediate state in between, but these little states that operated in Ukraine did not last long post the start and the fall of the Russian Empire. Just, again, more history for you, because Richard Land doesn't know this stuff. It's interesting to note that polling shows that 90% of voters voted for independence in Ukraine nationwide. Almost 77% of voters supported independence in the Russian majority Donetsk. Even in the heavily Russian Crimea, 59% voted for independence. This would lead one to believe that even Ukraine's ethnic Russians preferred Ukrainian freedom to reunification with Mother Russia under Vladimir Putin, which he's conflating two things here. Again, because Richard Land doesn't know history. Vladimir Putin didn't take over the Russian Federation directly after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not that's not when Vladimir Putin took over. I believe he took over early 2000s or very late 1990s. So you have like 7+ years in between that, where Yeltsin, I believe, was president of Russia. Maybe someone else was before him. I'm a little rusty on that part, but he's trying to use 1990 votes, or a vote in 1991 to justify what, current borders. That's not a good argument, because first of all, they weren't voting against reunification under Vladimir Putin. In fact, if we want to point to popular sovereignty, because he's using a popular sovereignty argument, and I agree that there is a Romans 13 foundation, in my opinion, for choosing your sovereign government. I do believe that there's biblical grounds for the will of the people choosing their government between two competing governments. And the people of Crimea actively now support reunification with Russia. The people of Donetsk have been fighting the Ukrainian government for 8 years, almost 9 years. They support independence from Ukraine. So he's trying to use a popular sovereignty argument, but he doesn't use it consistently here. But this article gets way worse, because, he starts shaming you for not supporting Ukraine. In early 2022, Putin, observing a shameful American abandonment of Afghanistan, decided that this was an opportune time to reunite Ukraine with Mother Russia by force. In other words, America's apparent weakness in withdrawing from Afghanistan was more temptation than Vlad could withstand. So let's actually revisit what the Russian war goals are for Ukraine, because Russia wants to annex part of Ukraine, the Russian parts. They want to demilitarize Ukraine, and they want a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality. Those are Russia's war goals. They haven't stated that they want to take over all of Ukraine and reunite, specifically Western Ukraine, the part that borders Poland. they have not expressed an interest in conquering that part. So this is saber rattling. This is neoconservative cringe, but you're here for the to debunk the neoconservative cringe. And this was the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for 30 years, I believe. I believe it was a 30-year term, tenure there. And he gave up his job for Russell Moore. So there's a lot of foreshadow here. I think Richard Land was always bad, but it gets worse. Because Putin also miscalculated on the Ukrainians' will to resist. Fortunately, President Biden decided to assist Ukraine, enabling Ukrainians to this point successfully resist the Russians. Of course, if he had aided them earlier, Russians might not have gambled on the invasion in the first place. So, have they successfully resisted? Current recording of this video, they're getting completely handled in Bakhmut, which is the most strategically important front of the Ukraine war right now. And it's been that way for quite some time, the Bakhmut front. And I believe they did just lose a major battle again. So the point that I want to make here is that this is like World War I, because in World War II, Hitler could circumvent the Maginot Line. Vladimir Putin cannot circumvent the Maginot Line here. So in their restructured invasion, because they've restructured it, it's a lot more stable. It's a lot less. It's a lot more atrocious on the Ukrainian side. It's attrition all around, but typically the person going on the offensive is the one who suffers higher casualties. But they've been able to do that at a rate that bleeds out the Ukrainians at a much higher rate. And the Ukrainians have not really been able to take back territory by force. That is perhaps the biggest. That's how Ukraine can't win this war, because they can't take territory back by force. They can take territory back if Russians make a coordinated, or in some cases an uncoordinated, retreat. Then they can capitalize. But even before they retook Kherson, they suffered high casualties in that campaign. And then Russia said, we're going to give up, restructure. And then they've been really just grinding the Bakhmut area, which is the most strategic area, even during the Kherson offensive. And Ukraine hasn't been able to launch offensive after offensive. They don't really have the capability to launch offensive. They don't have the troops. So at the current rate, Ukraine will have more guns. We will keep sending them weapons, but they will have fewer and fewer bodies to man them. That's the current trajectory of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia did a mobilization, but they haven't really deployed the mobilized troops to Ukraine yet. They haven't really deployed them there. They deployed them on like their western borders, like against Finland, in Belarus for training and stuff like that. But they could have a lot more boots on the ground than they currently do. Much of the war effort is being handled by groups like the Wagner Battalion, which is a paramilitary outfit that Russia has been backing for going on a 9th year now. So that's the main belligerent. One of the main belligerents in this war is the Wagner group. So, and they don't report casualties or anything like that, so we're not sure how many people they've lost. But they've been at war for 9 years almost. That's the key, and they haven't won. They haven't beaten the Wagner and the Donetsk, you can call them Russian proxies, and yes, they are Russian proxies. But Ukraine has not been able to beat them in 9 years. They haven't been able to take territory. Someone is sitting in a chair. They have no ability to kick them out of the chair and take the chair. If someone leaves the chair, then they can take the chair and sit down in it, but they haven't been able to take the person out of the chair. That's the problem with Ukraine's war effort. So we got some Biden praise for a bad Biden policy. And then here's where he starts shaming you, the conservative, you, the Christian, who doesn't want to support Ukraine. I have been shocked and ashamed at the reaction of some conservatives who have opposed America's support for Ukrainians, criticizing President Zelensky for cracking down on freedom of speech and placing restrictions on the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. The leadership of that church opposes Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. And yes, these are, anti-free speech policies. That's just the way it is. And then he goes on to say, I would remind these conservative critics that President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and at the beginning of World War II, we threw approximately 150,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps in the wake of Pearl Harbor without any due process. Again, these are not good things. To me, and I talked about this with John Harris. We'll talk about President Lincoln first. Then we'll talk about the example that he leaves out after we talk about the examples he brings up. So Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in order to jail state politicians. That is an abuse of power. That is not what habeas corpus was designed for. And I'm someone who does believe that the president has the authority to suspend it. But he misused that power, constitutionally speaking. Now, in World War II, again, it was unjustified to put the Japanese in internment camps, and it didn't really help the war effort. It's kind of a myth. We didn't need to do it, first of all. It wasn't constitutional, second of all. And, the Japanese, America cracked Japan's code, so early into the war. We cracked our code so early that it wouldn't have made a difference had we not interned the Japanese. If they are sending messages back to Japan, we would have caught that because we cracked the Japanese code. So, not a good plan. The example he leaves out is when we jailed Americans for opposing America's involvement in World War I. That would actually be the most similar example to what Ukraine is doing, in my opinion. That's the most similar analogy. Whereas America jailed Americans for opposing World War I involvement. That was Woodrow Wilson policy. And they were right to oppose World War I involvement. So it's interesting how he leaves out that saber-rattling abuse of power. And he calls them conservatives in quotes because he's a neocon. And he wants to, talk down on us because we actually understand history and foreign policy better than he does. And let's see, even vibrant democracies get pretty testy when their survival is at stake. In the wake of 9/11 attacks, our government surveilled mosques. Really? Are you kidding me, Richard Land? I know that the ERLC has a larger history of supporting religious liberty for Muslims than it does Christian believers. But 9/11 and you're talking about mosque surveillance and not the Patriot Act, which might have been included in the Patriot Act, but broadly speaking, the Patriot Act, you're leaving that off the table. That's how you know this is such crap. That's how you know Richard Land isn't on your side. The Christian Post isn't really on your side. I'm frankly bewildered. He's bewildered by the conservatives' criticism of President Zelensky for appearing before a joint session of Congress in a military-style fatigue dress. What? He was wearing a t-shirt, wasn't he? Do they not remember Churchill in the military jumpsuit during his visit to America in the midst of the hour of Britain's greatest peril in 1941, which is World War II? For me, the assistance provided to Ukraine is a matter of national honor. I pointed that out in the 2014 The Christian Post Nuclear Proliferation Ukraine and the Cop on the Beat. The United States formally guaranteed to protect Ukrainian sovereignty if they gave up nuclear weapons they had inherited from the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. At that point, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world based on nuclear weapons they inherited from the former Soviet Union. The Clinton administration, rightly concerned about these weapons ending up in the hands of terrorists, made it a high priority to urge Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons in return for economic aid and security guarantees. The result was the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, which Ukraine gave up its nukes and signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a UN treaty. And Russia, Britain, and the US pledged to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. So what happened? What happened? Well, Ukraine had a coup in 2014. I think that voids the Budapest Memorandum. That's not the same government. That's not the same, that is a new government. That would be like, and, unfortunately this did happen, like the British agreed with the Chinese king, I believe, to give up Hong Kong. They didn't make that arrangement with the People's Republic of China, the communist Maoist. They didn't agree with the Maoists to do that, so the deal was void because they weren't, one of the participants in the agreement was no longer in existence. And likewise, the same thing here. They had a coup in 2014 that overthrew a legitimately elected president of Ukraine. And you expect this agreement to still stand? I don't think it does. I think it's void when that happens. Does the United States want to further destabilize the world in order by once again going back on our word or failing to keep our word to other countries? If the answer is yes, think about what that would do for all our other commitments to allies around the world. If we allow Russia to succeed in this aggression, the world will become a much more dangerous place as naked aggression is rewarded. Would it, though? I think risking World War III over Ukraine is actually far more dangerous than letting Ukraine fall to Russia. What has Ukraine ever done for the United States? Been a hotbed for American corruption here? Been a proxy for the World Economic Forum? What have they done for us? The answer is nothing except fuel the corruption here. That's what Ukraine has done. It is a corrupt nation that has corrupted, that has been the piggy bank, the money laundering piggy bank for American politicians, Democrat and Republican. Let them fall. We are actually better off if Ukraine is no longer the money laundering corruption, kleptocracy that it was. We are better off that no longer is on the map. Let's put America first. But wait, there's more. Furthermore, let's clearly understand what would be happening in Ukraine if, absent American and Western military aid, the Russians had prevailed militarily. And this is where we get into fantasy land. Based on Russians' behavior in the areas of Ukraine they have occupied, the picture is not pretty. There has been a mass rape of Ukrainian women in occupied territories. The New York Times reported Ukrainian women who have been raped repeatedly, saying that Russian soldiers told them that they wanted to sexually assault the Ukrainian women so repeatedly that these women would never want to be intimate with any man again, resulting in fewer Ukrainian babies. Does that sound accurate? Like that's just some wartime propaganda there. Like That's what the Soviets said about the Germans. That's what the Germans said about the Soviets. Come on. I don't buy that for a second. I think that's fake news, wartime propaganda. Second, based on mass graves and makeshift torture chambers uncovered in occupied areas of Ukraine that have been liberated, we would have concentration camps all across Ukraine with execution of Ukraine's political and cultural leaders. Okay, what about the areas that are in Donetsk? Do they have concentration camps in Donetsk? Do they have concentration camps in Crimea? They have concentration camps in Australia. Don't they also have concentration camps in Canada? And they do in China as well. Third, Ukrainian language would be banned in every area of society. That's kind of odd, isn't it? Because Ukraine actually passed a language law. I believe this was in 2019, or it was around the time Zelensky took over. They had a language law that pretty much bans if you operated a radio station in a different language other than Ukrainian, doesn't matter whether it's Russian or English, you would be heavily fined or the government would crack down on that. Same with handing out literature, publishing books, newspapers, stuff like that. So Ukraine actually has a language law that is aimed at culturally genociding the Russian culture and language, as well as an ethnic group. They want to culturally genocide them out of the culture. Fourth, and that's one of the reasons why there are a bunch of ethnically Russian or Russian-speaking Ukrainians that are pro-Russia in this war. Fourth, approximately 150,000 Ukrainian children have already been kidnapped by Russians and sent to Russia to be raised by Russian parents. If Russia is ultimately triumphant in this conflict, several 100,000 more Ukrainian families will have their children kidnapped and sent to Russia for adoption. Interesting point. There's a couple truths and a couple not truths to this. First of all, when Russia took over territories, they evacuated civilian populations. This was very true in Kherson. Obviously, not everyone stayed, not everyone, or left, I should say, but they evacuated children from war zones. And a lot of civilians got to leave the war zones as well. That was especially true in Kherson. So I don't know how much that is true. Again, I don't buy the Ukrainian propaganda. It's worth noting that Russia is in the midst of a demographic meltdown, them and the rest of Europe. According to the demographer and economist Peter Zeihan, and he has a book, Zeihan explains that the one reason that Putin invaded Russia now is to give their horrific demographics in a decade he would not have enough potential soldiers to invade. So some truth to demography is history, is the future. That's been a Republican talking point as it relates to Hispanic vote. Do the Russians have any of that going on? Sure. Keep in mind, second to the United States, people immigrate to Russia. They're like the second biggest immigrant draw nation in the world. At least that was true at one point in time. I don't know if that's still true, but a lot of people immigrate to Russia. They're second to the United States in that regard. So, furthermore, how does anyone think that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, he will stop there? He will continue his aggression until he is stopped. If Putin is allowed to succeed, NATO will unravel as the nations of Europe, no longer able to trust the United States, will seek their own accommodation with Putin. And again, I must raise the question, what has NATO ever done for the United States? Like, let's actually phase NATO out and post fall of the Soviet Union NATO. Okay, they joined us in the invasion of Afghanistan. Big deal. Historically speaking, we didn't actually need to invade Afghanistan. Bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan, who we gave a lot of money to. Pakistan, that is, not Bin Laden. But although Bin Laden, if you go back in history, he was CIA. And this is just someone who doesn't know how to upgrade their operating system when it relates to history. If we allow Putin to succeed in Ukraine, the world will quickly become a far more dangerous and barbarous place. Dictatorial fellow travelers in China and Iran will be emboldened to act in ever more barbarous ways as well. And in the Ukraine, America and the West have found a real country in every sense to help defend, not merely aspiring countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, invasion of Iraq, not a good idea. And America lied and destabilized an entire country over the lie that there was yellow cake uranium and a nuclear program going on in Iraq. We lied about that, or the government lied about that. America lied to the whole world about that. What is he saying? Like, if anything, America's actually the force, and, Israel as well, are the forces that are destabilizing the world. If you look at the Middle East, the Arab Spring specifically, I've done a lot of research on the Syrian civil war, and the Syrian civil war, the Russians were actually stabilizing the region. The Russians were actually fighting ISIS, whereas America pretty much created ISIS. It's pretty odd that a paramilitary just upstarts and takes over swathes of territory in Syria, and then they invaded Iraq. And it was the Russians who helped negotiate a peace in that region because, Turkey had their own motives, and the Kurds and the Syrians and a lot of groups there. But it was the Americans who destabilized Syria. It was the Americans who helped destabilize Libya and Egypt and Iraq and Afghanistan. The Americans did that, not the Russians. The Russians didn't destabilize the Middle East. So, what world is Richard Land living in? Not a world where you study history. But again, like I said in the beginning of the video, he's World Economic Forum. The Ukrainians are not asking for anyone to fight for them. Actually, they are. They are fighting quite bravely and well for their own freedom. No, they're not. They are fighting to join the European Union. They are fighting to join NATO. Neither of those are acts of freedom. You lose your sovereignty when you join the European Union. That's part of the deal. They are not asking us to fight. Yes, they are. They want American boots on that ground. All they are asking for us, or from us, are the weapons with which to fight. And how do they expect to pay for those? Oh, we're supposed to pay for those. Keep in mind, Ukraine it's a Lend-Lease program, so to speak, and we've lent a bunch of money to them. Other nations have lent a bunch of money to them, which is inflationary, by the way. The European Union is collapsing its economies by loaning endless money to Ukraine because that's inflationary. That's an inflationary lending. And that works for the United States as well. Our inflation is driven by congressional spending. And he has a point to make about fiscal policy here in a second. But first of all, a number of things are true here. They want weapons, yes. NATO countries are depleting their entire arsenals to prop up Ukraine. And so when we act like this is World War III. And it could get hotter. But Ukraine is not worth fighting World War III over. We do not want to be on the side of the Germans in a world war, but that's what we are on. And we don't want to be on the German side in a world war. They lose every single time. The shameful argument that some conservatives are making is that all this is costing us too much financially to aid the Ukrainians. It would be far more costly not to do something. Again, that's a lie. If we do nothing, nothing happens. Ukraine falls. Big deal. I don't care. If you wanted Americans to have the stomach for war, you shouldn't have been in Afghanistan for 20 years. You shouldn't have lied about Iraq. If you wanted Americans to have the stomach for a foreign conflict, you shouldn't have lied about the last two. And you shouldn't have destabilized Libya. You shouldn't have destabilized Syria. There's a credibility issue here, and it's with the American government. This is costing us too much because not only are we spending the money, we're printing the money, and it's not working. The Ukrainians aren't winning. More people will die from us propping up a paper state, a paper army. that is, or maybe not paper, but as soon as the weapons run out, they will fold. Or what the other option is, as soon as the bodies run out, they will fold. Which one's going to happen first? Do more people have to die in order for Ukraine to come to the peace table and accept a peace deal that they could have gotten in February of 2022? They could have gotten a peace deal, probably the same peace deal that this war will end with: Ukrainian neutrality, annexation of certain territories, and I already said neutrality, and a demilitarization. But the demilitarization looks like it'll happen because Ukraine's military is just going to get destroyed incrementally over the time of this war. Now, I think this war is going to last at least another year. But one of these things is true. The Ukrainians will either run out of weapons or they will run out of bodies. They cannot outlast Russia in either category. Because the Russians can just buy cheap little, or not buy, actually I believe the way that it works is they get these drones, these Iranian drones that are manufactured in Russia and shipped on the front. They're cheap. And they can just keep doing that. And they have more bodies. Doesn't matter how many New York Times articles are written out there. We are propping up a nation that cannot win. A nation that is in our best interest if it doesn't win. Because again, Ukraine is a hotbed of corruption in the United States. That is where all the corruptocrats go, is Ukraine. It actually benefits our enemies here domestically if Ukraine falls. And if they surrendered right now, that would probably be the best human, as far as humanitarian crisis goes in mitigating that, if they surrendered right now. The shameful argument that some conservatives are making that it costs too much. And he wants to make the argument that it would cost us more not to. That is a sunk cost fallacy. Plus, if you give any fair-minded person 24 hours with the federal budget, they could find enough waste to arm Ukraine for years to come. That is the waste. The Ukrainian aid is the waste. The Israeli aid is the waste, because I'll go there well. The Pakistani aid for gender studies is the waste. The Kennedy Center is the waste. This guy hates our country. The world of freedom-loving nations, of which the European nations are not among. Let's be real here. Canada is not a freedom-loving nation. Australia and New Zealand are not freedom-loving nations. Should draw inspiration and resolve from our incredibly brave compatriots, the Ukrainians. I proudly wear a Ukrainian lapel at every day as an act of solidarity. Such bravery should never be abandoned, but wholeheartedly supported. Richard Land has always been a bad guy. He counseled some people to get an abortion as a result of a car accident. He's proposed compromise on the issue of homosexuality for years and years. He attacked Uganda for doing a policy that we would call Christian nationalism today, actually. He's shilling for Ukraine shamelessly, acting like our freedom is on the line here. It's not. It wasn't in World War I. America could have avoided World War II. That's a red pill. It wasn't in our interest to defend China or embargo Japan. It wasn't in our interest to do that. And we can easily avoid this conflict. We can avoid World War III. And I hope the Republican Congress puts the kibosh on all this funding. I would want nothing more than to see that. at least out of this Congress, because I don't think we'll get much out of Congress. But if we can defund Ukraine, that'd be epic. Let's put America first, and let's get these people who are neocons and kick them out of Christian publications. Christian Post needs to fire Richard Land because he sucks at his job. He is an enemy in the church. And he's wrong on too many issues that are important, and he's a waste of space. Send him back to the World Economic Forum where he belongs. My name's Ray. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. If you like this kind of content, subscribe and have a blessed day. We will catch you on the next one.